The letter arrived before she did, and by the time Belle Shelton's wagon rolled through the iron gate of the Double V Ranch on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1882, every man on the spread already knew what the letter said, and every single one of them had taken a deliberate step backward. The dust had barely settled around the wheels of her borrowed wagon when the bunkhouse door swung open, and 6 ranch hands filed out into the yard, pulling their hats off with a kind of nervous reverence that was more suited to a church than a cattle operation. Belle sat upright on the buckboard seat, her black morning dress worn but pressed, her dark hair pinned back tightly beneath a wide-brimmed hat that had seen better seasons. She held the reins with steady hands, which was the first thing Raymond Vaughn noticed about her. The second thing he noticed was that she looked at him directly. Raymond stood at the top of the porch steps with his arms folded over his chest, his hat pushed back on his head, a jaw darkened by 2 days of stubble, and a pair of eyes the color of cold creek water. He was 34 years old and had been the foreman of the Double V for the past 6 years, ever since old Chester Vane had shaken his hand and told him he was the only man in 3 counties he trusted not to steal from him or sleep past sunrise. Chester Vane had died 4 months ago in the winter, and now the spread belonged to his nephew back east, who had no intention of running it himself and had sent word asking Raymond to keep things operating until something permanent could be arranged. Something permanent, it turned out, was a widow named Belle Shelton. She climbed down from the wagon without waiting for anyone to offer a hand, landing in the dirt with a quiet grace that made the youngest of the ranch hands, a 20-year-old boy named Pete Calloway, actually take another step backward and bump into the man behind him. The letter Raymond had received 2 weeks prior had been written by a man named Foreman Hatch over at the Caldwell spread in Nebraska. Raymond knew Hatch by reputation only, but what the letter said had been more than enough to send a ripple through the whole crew. The letter said that Belle Shelton had managed the books for the Caldwell spread for 3 full years following her husband's death. It said she understood cattle, understood accounts, understood what it meant to keep a payroll clean and a herd counted. It said she could ride and she could shoot if necessary, though Hatch hoped it would not come to that. And it said that any man who underestimated her would find himself at a significant disadvantage in short order. The letter was practical and matter of fact, but it was also clear that Hatch had written it with genuine respect, and in the world Raymond occupied, genuine respect from a man like Hatch was not a small thing. Belle Shelton walked directly to the porch steps and looked up at Raymond, and he looked down at her, and the entire yard went completely quiet except for the sound of the horses shifting their weight and the distant low of a cow from somewhere near the south pasture. "You would be Mr. Vaughn," Belle said. Her voice was clear and even and carried no apology in it. "I would be," Raymond said. "And you would be Mrs. Shelton." "I would be," she said, in exactly the same tone he had used, and he noticed the faintest trace of dry humor in her dark eyes before she looked past him at the house. "Is there a room prepared?" she asked. Raymond uncrossed his arms. "There is. Follow me." The men in the yard watched him lead her up the porch steps and through the front door without another word, and then they looked at one another, and Pete Calloway said in a voice barely above a whisper, "She is not what I expected." An older hand named Doyle Briggs, who had been working cattle since before some of these boys were born, squinted toward the closed door and said nothing for a moment. Then he picked up his hat from where he had dropped it in the dust, knocked it against his knee, and said, "No, she is not, and that is going to be interesting." The house itself was a well-built structure for its era, 2 stories of solid timber with a wide front porch and heavy shutters on the windows. Chester Vane had built it with permanence in mind, and it smelled of wood smoke and old leather, and the faint sweetness of the dried herbs. The previous housekeeper, an elderly woman named Mrs. Croft, who had gone to live with her daughter in town after Chester died, had hung along the kitchen ceiling. Raymond led Belle through the entrance hall and up the staircase without speaking, which suited her fine. She was absorbing the details of the place the way a person absorbs details when they already know they are going to have to understand every corner of it. "The room at the end is yours," Raymond said, pushing the door open and stepping aside so she could enter first. It was the guest room. Mrs. Croft kept it well. Belle walked in and set her travel bag on the floor near the washstand. The room had a window facing east and a wide wooden bed with a blue quilt folded at the foot, and it was clean and quiet and smelled of cedar. She stood at the window and looked out at the spread below, the fenced pastures rolling out toward the distant tree line, a creek catching the light somewhere to the northeast, the barn and the two outbuildings sitting solid and well-maintained. "How many head are you carrying?" she asked. Raymond blinked. He had been prepared for a great many kinds of conversations, but perhaps not that one quite so immediately. 740, give or take. We are expecting a calf count in about 6 weeks. "And the debt on the property?" He leaned against the doorframe, studying her profile. "Nothing significant. Chester ran a clean operation. There is a note with the Territorial Bank in Dunmore for feed supplies last autumn, but it is current." Belle turned from the window. "Mr. Vane's nephew. Does he intend to sell eventually?" "That is the general understanding." She nodded slowly, and Raymond noticed that she was working through something in her mind with careful, methodical attention, and he had the distinct impression that she was 6 steps ahead of a conversation she had not yet started. "Then we need to make certain this operation looks strong when the time comes," she said. "Whatever the eventual arrangement, a healthy ledger and a healthy herd will matter." "Mrs. Shelton," Raymond said carefully, "I want to be straightforward with you. The men here are good workers. They are also not entirely accustomed to taking direction from a woman." Belle looked at him with an expression that was not offended, not amused, and not uncertain. It was simply steady. "And you, Mr. Vaughn, are you accustomed to it?" He held her gaze for a moment, and something in the air between them shifted just slightly, the way the temperature shifts in the hour before a storm. "I am accustomed to working with whoever knows what they are doing," he said, and Foreman Hatch's letter was very clear. She gave a single short nod. "Then we will get along." She said it as a statement, not a question, and Raymond pushed himself off the doorframe and pulled the door partway closed as he left, and stood in the hallway for a moment with his hand still on the doorframe, thinking that he had met a great many people in his years out here, and he had a feeling this woman was going to be a complication he had not prepared for, not in any way that he could have anticipated. The first full day of work told him a great deal. Belle came downstairs at first light, before Raymond had even had his coffee, and she was at the table in the ranch office with the ledger books open by the time he came through the hallway. She had lit the lamp herself, brewed the coffee on the cast iron stove in the kitchen, and she handed him a cup without ceremony as he appeared in the office doorway. "The accounts are well kept," she said. "Your record-keeping is thorough, Mr. Vaughn." He took the coffee and sat down across from her. "I kept them myself after Chester died." She looked up. "You have a good hand for numbers." "I have a good hand for keeping things honest," he said, which was a distinction she seemed to appreciate, because the corners of her mouth moved very slightly. They went through the books together that morning, and Raymond learned that Belle Shelton had not been exaggerating or embellishing Hatch's recommendation. She understood cattle operations from the ground up, could read a balance sheet with the same fluency that Raymond read the weather in the clouds, and she asked exactly the right questions about the things she did not yet know, which were mostly specific to the Double V's arrangements rather than gaps in her general knowledge. By mid-morning, they had walked out to the south pasture together, and Belle had looked at the fences, the water supply from the creek, and the condition of the stock with an appraising eye that made Doyle Briggs, who happened to be riding the fence line on the far side, stop his horse and watch them for a while before shaking his head slowly and riding on. The trouble started on the 3rd day. It did not come from the men Raymond had expected it to come from. It came from a hand named Cutter Moss, who had been with the Double V for only 8 months, and who had a habit of expressing opinions that nobody had asked for. Cutter was 26, compact and rough-mannered, and he had opinions about women on cattle operations that he had not bothered to keep to himself inside the bunkhouse. Raymond had heard the noise of it through the wall but had decided to give things a few days before addressing it, hoping it would settle on its own. It did not settle on its own. Belle was in the yard near the corral, asking Pete Calloway about the condition of the south pasture gate that needed rehanging, when Cutter Moss came out of the barn with a lead rope in his hand and a smirk on his face that Raymond, standing near the water trough, recognized as nothing but trouble. "You planning on doing the work yourself, ma'am, or just asking the rest of us about it?" Cutter said, and the yard went quiet in exactly the way it had gone quiet the morning Belle arrived, except this time it was a different kind of quiet. Belle turned to face Cutter with that same even expression she had given Raymond in the doorway on her first day. "I am asking Pete because he has done this work before and I want an accurate assessment," she said. "If you have useful information to add, Mr. Moss, I am listening." Cutter's smirk held for a moment, but there was something uncomfortable underneath it now, because her response had been so completely reasonable and calm that it had nowhere to attach itself. "Just seems like a lot of questioning from someone who has been here 3 days, he said, which was a weaker thrust, and Raymond could see that Cutter knew it. "I have been here 3 days, Belle agreed pleasantly. "Which means I have approximately 362 days of learning left before I have been here a full year, and I intend to use every one of them. Thank you for the reminder, Mr. Moss." Pete Calloway made a sound that was not quite a laugh and turned it into a cough. Doyle Briggs, who was mending tack nearby, did not bother to disguise his smile. Raymond watched Cutter Moss struggle with the complete absence of any satisfying response, click his jaw shut, and walk away still holding the lead rope, and he felt something warm and slightly surprised move through his chest that he decided to examine later, and then forgot about until it came back in a stronger form. That evening after supper, Raymond found Belle sitting on the porch in the blue dusk, her hands quiet in her lap for what he suspected was the first time that day. He came out with 2 cups of coffee and set one on the railing beside her chair without asking, and she accepted it with a brief nod. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, which was something Raymond did not experience often and had not realized he had missed. The ranch settled into its evening sounds around them, the horses calm, the night birds beginning, the distant sound of the creek. "You handled Moss well today," Raymond said eventually. Belle looked out at the darkening yard. "He is not a bad man," she said. "He is just uncomfortable." Raymond looked at her profile in the dimming light. "Most men out here are not accustomed to a woman who answers back in complete sentences. Is that what I did? I believe it is." She turned her head and looked at him, and in the low light her eyes were dark and soft, and he had to deliberately look back out at the yard because the alternative was staring at her in a way that would be inappropriate, and he was a man who prided himself on keeping his behavior appropriate. "My husband was a good man," Belle said quietly, and Raymond understood that she was offering context, which was a kind of trust. "But he was sick for 2 years before he passed, and I ran most of the operation those last years. Not because I chose to be the one who did it, but because someone had to and I was there. By the time he was gone, I had stopped asking for permission to do things and had started simply doing them." "How long?" Raymond asked. "Since you lost him?" 2 years in March," she said. "It will be 2 years this March." Raymond nodded. He did not say he was sorry because she had not said it to receive sympathy, and he sensed she would appreciate the distinction. "Why did you leave the Caldwell spread?" he asked instead. A pause. The night deepened around them. "Hatch's operation came to its natural end," she said carefully. "The Caldwell family decided to sell to a land company. There was no longer a place for what I was doing there." She turned her cup slowly in her hands. "Hatch wrote that letter before I even asked him to. He handed it to me and said to take it somewhere it would matter." Raymond thought about the letter, about the deliberate and thorough respect in every line of it. "He thought well of you." "He was a fair man," Belle said simply. I tried to earn fair treatment. Raymond looked down at his coffee cup. He thought about the 6 years he had run this spread, the long, dusty work of it, the satisfactions and the loneliness of it, the particular kind of tiredness that came not from labor, but from being the only person around who saw the full picture of a thing. He had not acknowledged that loneliness to himself in a long time, and its sudden clarity now was not entirely comfortable. "You will do fine here," he said finally, which was true but was also not the full thing he was thinking, and he left the rest of it quiet. "Thank you, Mr. Vaughn," she said. Not Raymond, Mr. Vaughn, which was correct and appropriate and somehow more noticeable than if she had used his first name. He went inside and sat at the table in the kitchen for a long time before he went to bed. The weeks that followed were ones of gradual and intricate adjustment, like the way a river carves new channels slowly enough that you do not notice the change until the landscape has already shifted. Belle became a presence on the double V that was neither loud nor aggressive but simply constant and competent. And competence, Raymond had always believed, was the great equalizer in the West. It did not matter who you were or where you came from if you could do the work and do it well, and Belle Shelton could do the work. She renegotiated a supply contract with the grain merchant in Dunmore that saved the ranch $12 a month, which does not sound like much until you multiply it out over a year and realize it represents a significant portion of a ranch hand's seasonal wage. She reorganized the records so that the cattle count was cross-referenced against the pasture rotation schedule in a way that Raymond immediately recognized as more efficient than the system he had been using, and he adopted it without ego because good sense was good sense. She learned the name of every horse and every hand and every dog on the property within the first 10 days, which made a noticeable impression on the men, because most owners and managers did not bother with the dogs. Cutter Moss remained wary and somewhat sullen for the better part of 2 weeks, and then one afternoon the big bay gelding that Cutter was particularly attached to came up lame with a stone bruise, and Belle was the nearest person, and she knelt in the dirt without a second thought, and worked the stone loose with steady hands and a hoof pick she had in her apron pocket without making any fuss about it. And after that, Cutter Moss was never anything but respectful to her face. Even if Raymond suspected it took longer than that for the attitude to fully shift. Doyle Briggs became something like a quiet ally, the kind who never says much directly, but who makes his position clear through small daily actions. He began leaving the coffee ready in the mornings on the days when Belle arrived in the kitchen before Raymond did. He brought her wildflowers once and left them on the porch rail without comment, which was a gesture so unexpected from a man of 61, with a face like weathered saddle leather that Pete Calloway told the story in the bunkhouse 3 times. Raymond watched all of this from a careful distance, because it was his job to watch how the operation worked together and to manage the friction before it became damage. That was the practical reason he paid attention to Belle Shelton. That was the reason he told himself he was paying attention. But the practical reason did not account for the way his awareness of where she was in any given space had become automatic and precise in a way that had nothing to do with management. It did not account for the fact that he had begun to find reasons to be in the office when she was working there, or to take the same pasture fence route on mornings when he knew she would be checking the south gate. It did not account for the particular clarity of mind he seemed to have when she was nearby, the way a complicated problem became less complicated when he could think it through out loud to her, and she would lean against the fence post and listen without interrupting, and then say one precise thing that reoriented everything. He was not a man who examined these things easily. He was a man who had spent 6 years in the practical physical world of cattle and land and weather and labor, and the interior landscape of feeling was a country he did not often travel. But he was also honest with himself in the way that a man has to be honest when he lives alone with his own thinking for long enough. And by the end of the 4th week, He sat on the edge of his bed one night and told himself plainly that he was falling in love with Belle Shelton and that he did not know what to do about it. He decided, for the time being, to do nothing about it, because she was a widow who had arrived at his professional doorstep with a letter of recommendation and a suitcase, and she had not arrived looking for anything except work and stability, and he respected her far too much to make her working situation complicated or uncomfortable. She had found something steady here, and he was not going to disturb it for the sake of his own feelings. This was a very sensible resolution that lasted approximately 11 days. On the 12th day, a situation arrived that made sensibility considerably more difficult. A man named Earl Sutter rode onto the Double V in the middle of a Wednesday afternoon, while Raymond was out on the far north range, and most of the hands were with him doing fence work. Sutter was a land speculator who had been buying up smaller operations in the county for the past year, and he had been sending increasingly persistent inquiries to Chester Vane's nephew back east about whether the Double V might be for sale. Sutter was not a violent man, but he was a presumptuous one, the kind of man who confuses his own interest in a thing with a claim on it. Belle was in the office when he arrived, and she was alone in the house. Sutter dismounted at the front gate, came up to the porch, and did not knock. He walked through the front door as though he owned the place, which he did not, and when Belle looked up from the desk, his entire manner made clear that he had not expected to find a woman there and was not sure what to make of it. "Who are you?" he asked, in a tone that was not hostile exactly but was also not respectful. Belle set down her pen. "Who are you, and what is your business walking into this house without knocking?" she said, with a composure so complete that Sutter actually stopped walking. He recovered. He told her his name and his interest in the property, and he spoke about it in the way that men of his type speak about things they want, as though the wanting of it is sufficient to make it reasonable. He said he would like to look around. Belle told him he would need an appointment with Mr. Vaughn, and that was not something she was able to arrange today. He said that he had come a long way. She said she was sorry to hear that, and picked up her pen again. He stood there for a moment with the uncomfortable expression of a man who has run a persuasion strategy that has simply stopped working, and then he said, "Ma'am, I am not sure you understand what I am representing here." "I understand completely," Belle said without looking up. "You are a speculator who would like to acquire this property. We are not presently interested in selling. The door is behind you." He left, which was the right outcome, but he left with a particular expression that Raymond recognized when Belle told him about it that evening, the expression of a man who has been thwarted but has not yet decided to accept it. Raymond listened to the whole account carefully, and when she was done, he said, "You did everything right." "I know," she said, not with arrogance but with the simple matter-of-fact tone of someone who has been in enough complicated situations to know the difference between getting it right and getting it wrong. He looked at her across the kitchen table, and the lamplight was warm between them, and she was looking down at her hands, and he felt the thing in his chest that had been building for 4 weeks press up against his composure with enough force that he had to look away and clear his throat and say something practical about writing to Chester's nephew about Sutter's interest so there would be a record of it. Belle looked up. "Are you all right?" she asked. "Fine," he said. "Long day." She looked at him for a moment with those dark eyes and said nothing, and Raymond had the extremely uncomfortable sensation that she could see directly through him, which was a sensation he was not accustomed to and did not know what to do with. The weather turned toward summer, and with summer came the hard push of the season, the long days that bled into short hot nights, the constant movement of men and horses and cattle, the accounting of calves and the management of water and the 100 small crises that any working ranch generates in quantity. Raymond and Belle fell into a rhythm of work that was so seamless it startled him sometimes when he noticed it from the outside, the way they anticipated each other's questions, finished each other's thoughts about the operation, could communicate across the length of the yard with a look when something needed attention. The men noticed it. Of course they did. Doyle Briggs noticed it in the particular way of a man who had been alive long enough to recognize the thing when he saw it and was quietly content about it. Pete Calloway noticed it with the delighted intensity of a 20-year-old who thought the whole thing was wonderful and kept nearly saying something about it out loud before catching Doyle's warning look. Even Cutter Moss, who had come around considerably by now, noticed it and made a private accommodation with the fact that Raymond Vaughn was losing his heart to the widow woman, which Cutter found somewhat reassuring because it made Raymond seem more human. In June, they rode the property line together, just the two of them, which was a practical necessity because Belle needed to understand the full extent of the boundaries and Raymond was the one who knew them best. They spent the whole of a long June day on horseback in the open country, and somewhere in the middle of it something changed. It changed the way most important things change in real life, without announcement, without drama. They had stopped at noon beside a wide bend in the creek to water the horses, and Belle had taken off her hat to let the air reach her hair, and Raymond had turned from watching the horses drink and had looked at her standing in the green shade beside the water, and she had turned and looked back at him, and the looking was different from every other time they had looked at each other. There was no question in it. There was something else. Something that was simultaneously very simple and very serious. Neither of them said anything immediately. Belle put her hat back on and Raymond looked back at the horses, and they remounted and continued riding the property line, and they spoke about the northeast fence condition, and the water rights question on the Far Creek tributary, and everything was exactly as professional and practical as it had always been, except that it was also completely different, and both of them were aware of that. That evening they came back at dusk, tired and dusty, and Raymond helped Belle down from the saddle the way he always did, offering his hand as she dismounted, which was a standard courtesy he had extended every time they rode together. Except this time when she landed and his hand was still holding hers, neither of them let go for a moment. Just a moment, long enough to be something. Then Belle said, "Thank you, Mr. Vaughn," in a slightly different quality of voice, and Raymond said, "Of course," in a slightly different quality of voice, and they went inside separately, and Raymond stood in the hallway for a moment with his hand still feeling the warmth of hers, and thought that the resolution he had made 6 weeks ago to do nothing about his feelings was going to need to be revisited. He spent several days being careful. He was careful in the way that a man is careful when he does not trust himself to be casual, measuring every interaction, watching her face for any sign that he had misread the moment at the creek, finding none because Belle Shelton's face when she was working did not give things away easily. He was also careful because there was a part of him that was genuinely uncertain. She had come here for work and stability, not for a complicated entanglement with the foreman, and the last thing he wanted was to make her feel that her position here had a condition attached to it. It was Belle who resolved his uncertainty, which in retrospect should not have surprised him. On a Friday evening in late June, after supper had been cleared and the house was quiet, Raymond came into the office to do the last entries in the week's accounts and found a note on top of the ledger, written in Belle's clear, precise hand. It said simply, "Tomorrow morning, if you wanted to ride the East Ridge before the day's work, I would not object to company." He held the note for a long time. He read it 3 times, not because he did not understand it, but because he wanted to be certain he understood it the way she intended it. It was cautious and considered and left him complete latitude, and it was also unmistakably an opening, held out with exactly enough care that he could walk through it or decline it without either of them having to bear the awkwardness of misinterpretation. He set the note back on the desk, completed the accounts, went to bed, and was up before dawn. Belle was already at the corral when he got there, saddling the gray mare she preferred, and she looked up when she heard him come through the gate, and the early morning light was thin and golden, and she looked at him for a moment before she said, "Good morning, Mr. Vaughn." "Good morning, Mrs. Shelton," he said, and something in the exchange had a warmth in it that was entirely new. They rode east as the sun climbed, up into the long ridge country above the ranch where the grass grew tall, and the view opened out across miles of territory, and the world was very large and very quiet around them, and they talked. They talked about things that had nothing to do with cattle operations or accounts or ranch management. Raymond talked about growing up in East Texas, about coming west at 22 with $20 and an entirely excessive amount of confidence, about the years he had worked other men's land before he found Chester Vane and stayed. Belle talked about her childhood in Missouri, about meeting Thomas Shelton when she was 22, about the years of their marriage that had been good and then the years that had been hard, and then the two that had been heartbreaking, about Foreman Hatch finding her in the barn one evening after Thomas passed, crying into the flank of the horse because she did not want the hands to hear her, and handing her a tin cup of coffee and saying nothing because nothing needed to be said. Raymond listened to all of it with the full attention of a man who understands that being listened to is a gift, and Belle listened to his telling with the same quality of attention, and by the time they reached the top of the East Ridge and the whole of the double V spread was laid out below them in the morning light, they had covered enough ground between them, interior ground, that something new was standing in the place where distance had been. Raymond stopped his horse. Belle stopped hers beside him. They looked at the view for a while. "Belle," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name, deliberately and without apology. She turned to look at him. "Raymond," she said, in the same tone. The simplicity of it was more honest than any elaborate declaration could have been. He reached across the space between their horses and put his hand over hers where it rested on the saddle horn, and she turned her hand over and held his, and they sat like that on the ridge above the ranch in the morning light without saying anything else for a while, because some things are said most clearly in silence. They rode back to the ranch together an hour later and went directly into the work of the day, which was exactly as demanding and practical as any other day, and to anyone observing them there was nothing visibly different. Except that when Doyle Briggs came into the office late that morning with a question about the South Pasture water trough, and found Raymond and Belle standing together at the desk over an open map, not quite touching but very close, he got his answer about the trough and went back out and said absolutely nothing to anyone, but the quality of his silence had a deep and satisfied warmth to it. The courtship, if you could call it that, which Raymond would have called it if pressed, though he would have done so with some embarrassment because the word felt too formal for what it actually was, moved slowly and with great care. They rode together in the early mornings when the day allowed it, which was 2 or 3 mornings a week. They sat on the porch in the evenings and talked until the stars were well established. They worked side by side through the long days with a partnership that had deepened from its original professional foundation into something that felt, Raymond thought, like the most natural thing he had ever known. He was aware that it needed to become something declared and proper, not for the sake of convention, but because the feeling was large enough that it deserved to be named. The uncertainty was not whether he loved her. He was certain of that with the same kind of certainty he had about things he knew in his bones. The uncertainty was the right moment and the right words, because Belle Shelton was not a woman you fumbled at. She deserved to be approached with the same directness and honesty she brought to everything. Sutter came back in early July. He did not come alone this time. He came with 2 men who had the look of hired muscle, and a document he claimed was an expression of interest from Chester's nephew back east, though he was cagey about the actual contents of it and declined to leave it for review. Raymond met him in the yard with Doyle Briggs and Pete Calloway nearby, and the conversation was short and extremely clear. Raymond told Sutter that any communication about the property's sale went through the registered agent in Dunmore, not through uninvited visits to the ranch itself, and that arriving with men whose purpose seemed to be intimidation was something Raymond intended to document and address through the appropriate legal channels in town. Sutter looked at Raymond for a long moment, the kind of look that is an attempt to find weakness and found nothing useful, and then he looked at the house and Raymond saw where his gaze went, and a cold anger moved through him, steady and controlled. "You leave," Raymond said quietly. Now they left. That evening Raymond wrote a long letter to Chester's nephew, Frank Vane, detailing Sutter's visits and behavior, and copied it to the county sheriff in Dunmore, a practical man named Hodges who Raymond knew, and who had a way of dealing with speculators that was both legal and discouraging. Belle sat at the table while he wrote, reviewing the South Quarter accounts, and when he finished she read the letter once and said, "Add that his title document, if it exists, has not been verified by any legal counsel retained by the estate," and Raymond added it. Frank Vane's response came 3 weeks later, and it said, among other things, that Sutter had no authorized claim and had been politely but firmly told to cease contact with anyone at the Double V, and that Frank had decided to deed the property into a proper management trust with Raymond as named trustee, which was not exactly the simple resolution Raymond had expected, but it was thorough and it was solid, and it meant Sutter had nowhere left to push. The summer deepened and the work was relentless, and the days were long and the nights were short and warm, and Raymond and Belle continued their slow approach to one another like two planets, whose orbits had been gradually drawing them into the same gravity. It was Pete Calloway who finally said something, though he would spend years wishing he had done it more gracefully. He had been carrying a bucket toward the water trough one afternoon when he nearly ran directly into Raymond, who was heading toward the barn, and Pete's face went through 3 expressions in rapid succession before he said, in a voice of 20-year-old earnestness, "Mr. Vaughn, I think everyone on this ranch is pulling for you in case that is useful information." Raymond stared at him. Pete went red from his collar to his hat brim. "I only meant," he said, "that she is real fine and anyone can see how you are and nobody is going to think a thing of it except that it is the best thing that has happened on this spread since I got here." Raymond was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Thank you, Pete." Pete nodded vigorously and escaped with his bucket at speed. That same evening Raymond asked Belle to walk with him out to the east pasture gate after supper, which was a completely unnecessary excursion on a working ranch at that hour, but she went without question, and they leaned on the gate in the cooling evening air and looked out at the cattle moving slowly in the last light. "I want to say something to you," Raymond said. Belle looked at him. "And I want to say it properly," he continued, "because you deserve to have things said to you properly." She was quiet, watching his face with those dark, steady eyes, and he could feel the patience in her, the willingness to let him find his words, and that patience itself was one of the things he loved about her. "I have been trying to determine the right moment for a while," he said. "I kept thinking I needed to find some perfect arrangement of circumstances, and then I realized that the perfect arrangement is just this: you and me and the evening and the truth of it." Belle was still. "I love you," Raymond said. "I have loved you since before I fully understood that I did, which is probably exactly how these things work. I am not in a position to offer you something grand or elaborate. I am a foreman with a management trust and a decent horse and 6 years of knowing this land. But I can offer you everything I have and everything I am, honestly and without reservation, for as long as you will have it." The silence that followed was not an anxious silence. It was the silence of a woman who takes serious things seriously, who does not say words she does not mean or rush the truth of something to make someone else more comfortable. Belle turned toward him and put her hand flat against the center of his chest, and he covered her hand with his, and she said, "I have been afraid," and the admission was quiet and careful. "Of what?" he asked. "Of this," she said. "Of wanting something this much again. Because the last time I wanted something this much I also had to watch it leave, and the leaving nearly undid me." Raymond's hand pressed hers more firmly against his chest. "I know," he said. "I know you know," she said. That is part of why it does not scare me as much as it should." She looked up at him, and in the last gold light of the evening her face was open in a way he had not seen it be open before. All the careful steadiness relaxed into something softer, and he leaned down and kissed her once, gently and with complete intention, and she kissed him back. And the east pasture gate and the cattle and the whole wide spread around them settled into the evening with a kind of deep natural contentment. They were engaged by August, which was the subject of approximately 1 week of quiet and satisfied commentary in the bunkhouse, and approximately 0 days of surprise from anyone on the Double V, because Doyle Briggs had seen it coming since the first morning Belle walked through the front gate and looked at Raymond Vaughn directly. The formalities were brief and sensible. Raymond wrote to Frank Vane, not because he was required to, since Belle's position had never been contingent on any such arrangement, but because Frank deserved to know that the situation at the Double V was a settled and healthy one. And Frank wrote back a warm and enthusiastic letter that Raymond read at the supper table while Belle pretended to be more interested in her coffee than she was, though he could see her smiling. There was a proper church in Dunmore, and the wedding was on a Saturday in October when the aspen along the creek had gone gold, and the air had that particular clean, cold sharpness of the high plains autumn. Most of the men from the Double V attended, cleaned up with varying degrees of success. Doyle Briggs in a suit that had probably last been worn in 1871, and Pete Calloway with his hair flat and careful, and a grin that threatened to overtake his entire face. Belle wore a dress the color of cream, not black, which was a deliberate and quiet statement, and she walked down the short aisle of the Dunmore church with her chin up and her eyes steady and fixed on Raymond, who stood at the front in his best coat and a good hat that he held in both hands, and when she reached him and he looked at her, he thought he had never in his life seen anything as fine. The vows were the traditional ones, and they said them in the clear voices of people who mean exactly what they are saying. And when the minister pronounced them, married, and Raymond kissed his wife in the small church in Dunmore with his hands framing her face, and the sunlight coming through the windows, and 4 ranch hands attempting not to make unseemly noise in the back pew. It was the kind of moment that brands itself into memory so cleanly that decades later it is still vivid. The autumn work of the ranch absorbed them fully, but with an added quality that Raymond had no precise word for. The partnership of their working life had always been strong, but the marriage added a dimension to it that he had not fully anticipated, the simple deep comfort of coming home to the same person every evening, of sharing the small daily things as well as the large ones, of sleeping and waking in the same house with the same warm certainty of each other's presence. Belle adapted to the role of wife of the foreman with the same natural capability she brought to everything, which meant that she did not adapt much at all, because she was already doing all the things that made the household and the operation run well. What changed was the ease between them, the way the careful distances of their courtship gave way to an open dailiness that was fuller and more comfortable than anything Raymond had allowed himself to imagine when he was standing at the top of the porch steps, watching a dusty wagon come through the gate. Winter on the Double V was hard, as winter always was on the plains. The wind came down from the north in December with its teeth bared, and the cattle huddled at the windbreaks, and the men worked shorter days with heavier coats, and the whole world reduced itself to the practical necessities of staying warm and keeping the stock alive. Raymond and Belle spent the long evenings at the table in the kitchen, often with a fire burning in the stove and Belle's reading beside her, and Raymond's maps spread across his end of the table, and the companionable quiet between them was one of the warmest things Raymond had ever known in a life that had included a fair number of cold winters. In January, Belle told him she was expecting. She told him on a Tuesday morning over coffee, with the snow falling outside the kitchen window, and she told him the same way she told him important things about the operation, directly and without theatrical preamble, but her eyes were different as she said it. There was something in them that was hopeful and tender and slightly afraid all at once. Raymond sat very still for a moment. Then he put both hands on the table and stood up and came around to her side and crouched down beside her chair and took both her hands in his and said, "Tell me you are all right." "I am perfectly all right," she said, with the same steadiness, though her voice had a quality that it did not often have. "And you are happy about it?" he asked, because he needed to know what she needed. She looked at him for a moment. "I am terrified," she said honestly, "and I am happier than I have been in years." He squeezed her hands. "That sounds about right," he said. She laughed, which was a warm, full sound that filled the kitchen, and he stood up and pulled her to him and held her carefully against his chest, and she let herself be held with a completeness that she did not allow herself often, and outside the snow continued to fall on the double V, and the double V bore it with its usual solid patience. Spring came again, the same as the last spring in its practical outlines, and entirely different in its interior texture. Belle continued to work through most of her pregnancy because she was Belle and sitting still was not among her capacities, though Raymond drew the line at anything that involved more riding than necessary, and she accepted this compromise with moderate grace. The men on the spread were collectively and somewhat awkwardly careful with her in the way that rough outdoor men sometimes are with pregnancy, treating it as something extraordinary and slightly beyond their comprehension, which Belle found privately amusing. Doyle Briggs left wildflowers at more regular intervals as the spring advanced, and Pete Calloway appeared to have decided that being generally helpful was the appropriate response to the impending arrival, and could be found doing extra tasks that had not been assigned to him with an eager energy that Raymond found both touching and occasionally hazardous. A boy was born in late June. He arrived in the world with considerable opinion and a full head of dark hair. On a Thursday morning, while Raymond sat outside the closed bedroom door in a state of completely undisguised tension for 4 hours, until the doctor who had been summoned from Dunmore came out and told him that his wife and son were both well. Raymond went in and stood at the side of the bed where Belle was propped against the pillows, looking tired and complete and more herself than anyone had a right to look after 4 hours of labor, holding a small, red-faced bundle that had already managed to reduce its volume to something like a murmur. Raymond sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his wife and his son for a long time without saying anything adequate. "He looks like you," Belle said. "He is too red to look like anyone," Raymond said. "That will pass," the doctor said from the doorway dryly. They named him Chester James Vaughn, Chester for the man who had made the double V what it was, and James for Raymond's father, who had died when Raymond was 19 and whom he had never stopped missing. Belle had chosen James without Raymond suggesting it, after he had told her about his father on the East Ridge in those first tentative mornings, and the choice of it moved him more than he showed. When Doyle Briggs heard the name, he walked out to the far south pasture alone for a while, and came back with his eyes slightly red and his jaw set in a manner that discouraged commentary, and nobody commented. Chester James Vaughn was a loud and emphatic baby who had strong opinions about meal times and warm blankets, and he was loved extravagantly by every person on the double V, including Cutter Moss, who had completed his transformation from suspicious hand to loyal employee, and who could be found on any given evening making faces at the baby on the porch, while Belle watched with the expression of a woman who finds the world occasionally more satisfying than she expected. The summer passed in the full, rich work of a healthy operation. The herd was strong, the books were clean, and the double V had the quality of a place that is genuinely well run, where every system and every person is in the right place for the right reasons. Frank Vane came out in August to see the property, which was the first time Raymond had met the man in person after years of correspondence. Frank was 38, thin, city-built, and somewhat nervous around horses, but he was honest and warm and clearly moved by the state of the ranch that had been his uncle's life's work. He spent 4 days there, toured the operation with Raymond and Belle, held Chester James with the expression of a man who does not hold babies often but is willing to try. And on the last evening over supper, he said that the management trust had been the best decision he had made in connection with the property, and that he intended to leave it structured exactly as it was for the foreseeable future. There was a moment later that evening when Raymond and Belle sat on the porch after Frank had gone to bed, with Chester James asleep in the cradle that Doyle Briggs had made during the winter months without being asked, and the stars were enormous over the open country, and the night was warm and still. Belle leaned her head against Raymond's shoulder, which was something she had started doing in the evenings when the day was done, a small, easy intimacy that still gave him a quiet, deep pleasure every time. "Do you remember your letter?" she asked. "Which letter?" he said. "Hatch's letter," she said. "The one about me." "I remember it very well," he said. "He told you I could do the work," she said. "He told you I could ride and shoot if necessary." "He told me quite a lot," Raymond said. Belle was quiet for a moment. "He did not tell you that I was lonely," she said simply. "He did not tell you that I had been carrying the work for so long that I had almost forgotten what it felt like to put any of it down. He could not have told you that because it was not his to know." Raymond turned his head to look at her. "Are you still lonely?" he asked. She looked up at him, and the expression on her face was so completely at peace, so fully settled, that the question answered itself before she spoke. "Not even for a moment," she said. "Not since the day I rode to the top of the East Ridge and found out that the foreman of the Double V was the kind of man who would hold a woman's hand in the morning light and not require anything else from it." Raymond put his arm around her shoulders and held her close, and the night spread itself around them in its enormous western darkness, and somewhere inside the house Chester James Vaughn slept soundly in his cedar cradle, and the horses stood quiet in the corral, and the creek caught the starlight to the northeast, and the Double V lay peaceful and whole under the summer sky. The years after that were years of deep and satisfying fullness, the kind that do not always announce themselves as significant while they are happening, but that reveal their value in retrospect. The ranch grew steadily, adding 30 acres of good pasture to the south boundary when a neighboring property came available at a fair price, and Raymond and Belle agreed, sitting at the kitchen table with the map spread between them, that it was the right move. The herd grew. The operation strengthened. Chester James grew with the particular unstoppable energy of a boy raised in open country, walking by 10 months, running by 13, and on a horse by the time he was 3, which delighted Raymond and made Belle very watchful. He had his mother's dark eyes and his father's jaw and the absolute confidence of a child who has never had reason to doubt that he is loved, and he attached himself to Doyle Briggs with a devotion that the old man reciprocated in his quiet way, spending hours teaching the boy the names of birds and the way to read weather in the clouds. In the spring after Chester James turned 2, Belle came to Raymond in the office where he was going over the season's cattle count, and she said simply, "We are going to need a second cradle." Raymond looked up from the papers. The same stillness came over him as the first time, followed by the same warmth, and he pushed the papers aside and gave her his full attention. "Are you all right?" he asked, because he always asked first. "I am perfectly all right," she said again, as she had the first time, though she was smiling more openly now, because the fear was smaller this time, not gone entirely but smaller, which was what 2 years of solid love will do to fear. This time they had a daughter, born in the late autumn when the aspens were gold again, which seemed right, as though the season had a particular affinity for the Vaughn family's significant moments. They named her Clara Me Vaughn, for no one in particular, and yet somehow perfectly suited to the small brown-eyed girl who arrived with considerably less volume than Chester James, and a quality of watchful attention that made Raymond say to Belle, in the first hours of the morning after Clara's arrival, "She is going to understand everything before she knows how to talk." Belle held her daughter and said, "Good," with immense maternal satisfaction. Chester James approached the cradle with the cautious territorial interest of a 3-year-old adjusting to competition, And then Clara Me turned her dark eyes on her brother and looked at him with that complete serious attention. And Chester James sat down on the floor next to the cradle and patted it gently and said, in a tone of settling decision, "She can stay." Doyle Briggs made a second cradle, and it was better than the first one. Cutter Moss left the Double V in the spring of the following year, not under any difficult circumstances, but because he had saved enough to put a down payment on a small operation of his own near the Montana border, which was what he had always been working toward. He shook Raymond's hand at the gate on his last morning, and then to Raymond's slight surprise he took his hat off to Belle and said, "Mrs. Vaughn, I want you to know that I was wrong at the start of it, and I have been aware of that for a long time." Belle looked at him steadily. "You did the work and you did it well," she said. "That is all that matters." Cutter put his hat back on, nodded once, and rode out through the gate, and Belle watched him go with the expression of a woman who considers books to be genuinely closed when they are closed. Pete Calloway did not leave. Pete Calloway appeared to have made a permanent life decision about the Double V somewhere around the time Chester James was born, and he was still there, older and considerably more capable than the 20-year-old boy who had stepped backward in the yard the day Belle arrived, learning the management side of the operation under Raymond's guidance with a genuine aptitude that Raymond had been watching develop for years. Raymond spoke to Belle about Pete one evening, about the possibility of formalizing his role, giving him more responsibility as Raymond and Belle looked toward a future that was less about managing every detail themselves and more about directing a well-trained operation. Belle listened and then said, "I have been thinking the same thing for 6 months," which was exactly the kind of conversation their marriage had always been made of. Pete was given the title of assistant foreman in the fall of the year that Clara Me turned 1, and he received the news with such visible emotion that he had to excuse himself for a few minutes to go collect himself, a fact that was never directly acknowledged by anyone and was privately cherished by everyone. The letter from Foreman Hatch arrived in the summer of that same year, a letter that Belle received on a Tuesday morning and read at the kitchen table while Raymond watched her expression move through something quiet and careful. Hatch was retiring. His health had been poor, and he was going to live with his son's family in Kansas. He wrote that he hoped she was well and that the Double V had been worthy of her, and that he thought often about the morning he had walked into the barn and found her crying into the horse's flank, and that he was glad he had written the letter. Belle folded it carefully and held it for a while. "He was a good man," Raymond said. "He was," Belle said. She looked at Raymond. "He sent me here. He knew what he was sending me to, even if I did not." Raymond was quiet for a moment, considering that. "Do you think he knew?" Belle's mouth curved in a way he had been looking at for years and would never stop wanting to look at. "I think he hoped," she said. "I think Hatch knew what he had in that letter, and he knew what kind of man you were, and he hoped." Raymond thought about the letter, about the careful respect in every line of Hatch's handwriting, about every man on the spread taking a step backward when that wagon rolled through the gate, about Belle's steady dark eyes looking up at him from the bottom of the porch steps. He thought about the east ridge in the morning light and the east pasture gate in the gold evening, and the way 2 cups of coffee on a kitchen table in the early morning could become the whole architecture of a life. "I am going to write him back," Belle said. "I want him to know." "Tell him we have 2, Raymond said. Belle laughed. "I will tell him we have 2 and a fine operation and a man who holds a woman's hand on a ridge at sunrise." "I held your hand," Raymond said. "Once. You were the one who kept coming back to that ridge." "You were always already there when I arrived," she said, which was true, and which was the kind of truth that contains more than its surface. Raymond came around the table and kissed his wife on the top of her head, and she turned and caught his hand and held it. And Chester James came running in from the yard at that moment covered in creek mud with Clara Me toddling determinedly behind him. And the kitchen was suddenly very full of noise and life, and the summer morning pressed in through the open windows with its smell of grass and warm earth. Later, much later, when the children were in bed, and the house had settled into its evening quiet, and the stars were doing what they always did over the open country of the Double V, Raymond and Belle sat on the porch the way they always did at the end of the day. His arm around her shoulders, her head on his chest, the creek catching the moonlight somewhere to the northeast. "Are you happy?" he asked, not because he did not know the answer, but because happiness was a thing he believed should be asked about out loud. Belle was quiet for a moment, in the comfortable way that meant she was considering rather than uncertain. "I arrived here with a letter," she said. "I arrived with a borrowed wagon and a travel bag and a letter that said I could do the work. And I could. I have always been able to do the work." She turned slightly to look up at him. "But I did not know that the work would lead here. I did not know that there would be this." "What is this?" Raymond asked softly. Belle turned back to the dark yard, the cattle quiet in the distance, the lantern light from the bunkhouse a warm amber dot in the dark, the whole wide spread lying steady and peaceful around them. "Home," she said simply. "This is home." Raymond held her closer, and the Double V settled into its night, and the stars spread themselves across the sky with the extravagant indifference of stars that have always been there and will always be there, burning over the wide open country where a widow arrived with a letter and found everything she had stopped letting herself want, and a foreman stood on a porch with his arms folded and his jaw set and fell in love before he knew it was happening. And the whole great wild country around them witnessed it without comment, which was exactly the way the land always received the things that mattered. And in the cedar cradle that Doyle Briggs had made by the kitchen fire, and in the small bed where Chester James slept with his face turned toward the window and the moonlight on his dark hair, and in the morning that was already building itself on the far eastern edge of the sky, and in every coming season of the Double V's long life. The love that began on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1882, when a widow climbed down from a wagon and looked a foreman in the eye and refused to be anyone other than exactly who she was. That love was solid and permanent and rooted and true. The way the best things are, the way the land itself is, standing in the weather and holding its ground and growing stronger with every year that passes over it.